Hi everyone, welcome back. This week we're going to be diving into learning, cognition, and memory. This is one of my favorite sections to teach, and I hope you guys enjoy it too. So, just to provide an overview, we're going to be covering information processing assumptions. We're going to be then looking at sensory perception and attention, working memory, long term memory, and then we're going to be looking at factors that influence the long term memory. So we have long-term memory strategies, factors affecting retrieval, why learners sometimes forget, and then we're going to be covering learning myths, which is also really interesting. So let's go ahead and dive in. So we're going to start with some information processing assumptions, just like we do with the other learning theories, and we're also going to be building up from some of the theories that we've been covering in this course in the first couple of weeks. So we've now covered behaviorism, we've covered social cognitive learning theory, we've covered individual and social constructivism, and we're really going to be diving into the kind of cognitive components that were mentioned within individual and social constructivism. And so one of the first things is, what is information processing? So the heart of cognitive psychology is this idea of information processing, how we take information in the world and make sense of it with our brains. And so it's been theorized that information processing in humans resembles that of computers, where it's based on this idea where we're transforming information, where we're storing information, and we're retrieving information from our memory with things that we encounter in the world. So the idea of information processing is a model for human memory adopted by cognitive psychologists as a way to understand how human thought works. It's how we as humans interact within the world and take that information and then make it meaningful for us to then remember and then use that information as we then interact with the world. And so I talked about three different sort of mechanisms that look at how information is being processed, and I want to go ahead and define those. So that's encoding, storage, and retrieval. So, encoding is the process of transforming information in a meaningful way as it enters our memory system from sensory input, from our five senses. And how we interact with our five senses is how our brain encodes that information and transforms that information into a meaningful way. And once we encode that, we need to store that information. So, it's the process of putting what is being learned, things that we encounter in the world, into our own memory structures. And lastly, this process of retrieval is being able to retrieve that information and be able to use it and manipulate it in some way. So it's the process of recalling previously stored information. And we're going to be covering these three topics and how information is stored or information is being processed into our brains. So let's dive into some of the assumptions of the information processing approach. So one of the first assumptions is that information made available by the environment is processed by a series of processing systems. And these processing systems are through attention, perception, and working memory. So in order for us to learn or to grasp a topic or to remember something, we have to be paying attention. We also have to be perceptive about the type of information that is going to be processed. And that information, when we're processing and actively working on that information, we do that in our working memory. And we're going to be defining some of those later on in the series. So another assumption is that processing systems transform or alter the information in systematic ways. We talked about encoding and how encoding is like changing the information into a meaningful way that makes sense relative to that individual. So the construction of meaning and understanding through analysis of a stimuli. So something that we experience in the world being the stimulus, and how our brains encode and change that information or transform that information into something that we can utilize, into our schemas that is then developed so that we remember that. Remember, we talked about schemas in the previous section on constructivism. Another assumption is that mediational processes occur between the stimulus and the response. Again, we're seeing this dichotomy of stimulus and response throughout the different types of learning theories that we've been covering. So these mediational or mental events could be memory, could be perception, attention, or problem solving. These are known as mediational processes because they mediate, or they go in between the stimulus and response. So we're no longer looking at just behaviorism where, oh, an A to B, B to C situation where this causes that and then a cause and effect happens. There's something that's happening, these mediational processes that happen in between a stimulus and a response. Also, another assumption is that information processing in humans resembles that in computers, with the exception of emotions. So cognitive psychologists have set the metaphor that the brain works in a lot of ways similar to a computer. The mind works in a similar way to a computer, inputting, storing, and retrieving data. It's not exactly that like a one-to-one comparison, but it does help paint a picture or visualization of how we as humans store, encode, retrieve information through our brains that is very similar to how computers and the hard drives work. So to then summarize, the information processing approach characterizes thinking as the environment provides input, which is the stimulus of data, which is then transformed by our five senses. And then information can then be stored or encoded. So when we say encoded, what we mean is being transformed into a meaningful representation or in a meaningful way that makes sense relative to that individual. And then it's later retrieved from our long-term memory structures. And the results of information processing lead to specific behavior responses. So we are looking at the stimulus and the response, but we're looking at specifically with information processing, these kind of mediational events, what happens in between the stimulus and the response. And we're going to be finding that out over in the next sections.